Welcome to Conversations on Faith and Family, a faith-based podcast for parents and marriages looking how to manage and balance life with greater ease and fulfillment. Here are your hosts, Manuel and Raylene.
Hello, guys.
Hi.
Welcome to another episode here. I'm here with my wife, Raylene.
Hi, guys. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a beautiful 80-degree weather out here in Southern California. I think we're in springtime. Last week it was raining. This week it's nice and sunny.
You never know.
You just never know, really.
We'll have a blizzard next week.
No, it wouldn't surprise me. Just how unpredictable the weather's been. But like I said last week, we are just really, really excited, especially about this episode. I've been really anxious and really excited about this particular guest that we're going to have on, just because I think this is a topic that the church in general seems to kind of skip around a lot. I think sometimes it could even be a bad word in the church.
Yeah.
I think it's something that our discipleship is missing in today's world, but I think needs to be on the forefront of topics, the forefront of really being able to mold, especially if you deal with youth, with young adults. This needs to be a topic that is definitely on the forefront. So we have a guest on with us who really has a book that she just released, all right, and it's called Sex, Jesus, and the Conversations the Church Forgot. And we are really, really happy to have Mo on the podcast, all right. Mo, Isom, how's it going?
It is going great. I'm not getting that Orange County weather here, but I'll just be jealous from afar. I'm in Atlanta, and it's gloomy. But we're here.
And again, we'll shed some light through here, and hopefully you can feel a little warmer.
I'll take that.
Yeah. So, man, it's fascinating the background you've come from. You were an All-American soccer player.
Yes.
Man,
yeah.
That's awesome. I actually played sports in my day. Right now, my back wouldn't be able to, I can barely catch up with my little kids. But that is great. I'm a huge sports fan, so I'm a big fan of yours. So I know you released Sex, Jesus, and the Conversations the Church Forgot. Maybe you could just expound on, what made you write this book?
Yeah, great question. So I wrote my first book was called Wreck My Life, and it really moved through my testimony of coming to faith. So I say that because you mentioned the soccer. It moves through, sort of my young life, and then my athletics, and then identity issues that I struggled in, and then the suicide of my father, and then a really horrific car accident I was in. All the while that I was playing, Division I college soccer at LSU, and was an All-American. And so it was just this life that looked so great and amazing on the surface, and this deep struggle I was wrestling with, this adversity and brokenness I was wrestling with in the darkness. But it was in that car accident that Christ really revealed himself to me in an incredible way, and picked up my cross and carried it from that point forward. So I wrote Wreck My Life, sort of accounting my testimony of coming to faith. But I knew when I was writing it that I couldn't sell short my sexual testimony in it. I didn't just want to wedge it into that book, because I really felt like it was a topic that we needed to talk about. I mean, my sexual testimony was just a mess, and then so beautifully redeemed in that very same moment that Christ intersected my life and opened up my eyes to who he was and the power of the gospel, and what he had to say about my brokenness. Yeah. It also completely transformed my view of sex, of sexuality, of my decisions, of what I had been doing, of what he really called of me. And I knew that testimony needed legs of its own, because God has so much to say about sex, and we have so missed the mark for so long in discussing the beauty, the power, the act of worship that it is in celebrating sex in the right context for what God designed it for, but also in properly addressing the brokenness and the deviance and the sin. And it's just become so taboo, but because because it's taboo, we stay silent about it. And you have people wrestling with really, really broken things. And so I'm a little feisty, and I was kind of sick of the world staying quiet about it. Not the world. The world will actually tell you everything you want to hear.
You need to know. Yeah.
But the church, where we should really seek truth and guidance, staying silent about it, I kind of a little too feisty for that. I was like, we got to open up the conversation here.
Right. And, in your opinion, why does the church have an issue with discussing the topic of sex? Why do you think that it's hard for the church to discuss this?
I think really the world has stolen sex. The world has stolen the sanctity of what sex is, and it has twisted it, it's cheapened it, it's perverted it, and it is so dominated the sexual conversation, and really in so many ways bullied the church out of even having a word in edgewise. I mean, Lord, you can't even turn on the TV without a hamburger commercial being like overly sexual now. The world has just, the insatiable lust of the lost has so dominated this sexual conversation that I feel like in many ways the church has been suffocated out of the conversation a bit. And so when they do try to sort of insert truth or, get a word in edgewise, it becomes this quick, these are the do's and don'ts, and this is sin and this is not. And it becomes this incomplete presentation of it. But I think that's one area the church struggles. And another is that so many of us within the church are struggling in sexual sin. And so we're quiet about it. We don't want to talk about it because we're actually wrestling with it in the darkness. And so I think it's sort of a combination of things that have kind of muted the church. The enemy's won one over on us and keeping us shamed into silence because of our own struggles. And the world has kind of bullied us out of the conversation in relevance. And we've missed doing our job and rising up and reclaiming sex for the glory of God.
It always reminds me, because I think the misconception about even just the topic of sex is that, well, only single people deal with the sexual temptation. And I actually, in reading your book, you had mentioned a quote. You said, it's the enemy, when you're single, the enemy tries to get you to fall into sex and the sin of sex. But when you're married, he tries to get you out of that. It's almost how it's interesting how the enemy works to really be able to really use this type of sin to destroy our calling, to destroy the will of God in our life. And, I know that how are sexual sin and self-worth? How are those, would you say those are connected?
Yeah, it's so good that the passage in the book, because my sister-in-law told me that quote. She said, prior to marriage, the enemy will do everything he can to drive you together. And after marriage, the enemy will do everything he can to drive you apart.
So good.
And
oh, man.
It just echoes the truth that sex is so much more than just this physical act. God designed sex, and he designed us as sexual beings, and it was a gift from God. Mm-hmm. In the right context, it is this gift of unification, of power. It's a weapon against the enemy within marriage. It is this incredible identity woven gift that he gives us. I mean, the first conversation God has with man in scripture, he talks about sex. And he's saying, here, you are mine. I have formed you. Now be fruitful, go forth and multiply. And what he's saying in that one quick line, he's marrying together our inherent value and our sexual instruction. He's saying, you are not just here. You are his. You are mine. I've designed you. I've purposed you. I have plans for you. I desire to use you. Be, fruitful. And then it's saying, and also multiply, like take this gift that I've given you. Wield this weapon in the right context, come into my guidance and my direction. And it always was meant to be this beautiful marrying of the incredible worth he's given us as image-bearing creations of God and the incredible gift he's given us for unification. But when we when we sell that short, when we miss it, when we worship the gift instead of the gift giver, when we, twist this beautiful thing he's given us, I find that the very first thing it does is it unhinges us of our self-worth and our value, because they were always married together from the start. But when we separate the two and we think, oh, I'm going to choose for myself what's best for me. This is a urge I have. This is a want I have. I don't know about this design of waiting till marriage, of whatever it may be. It's amazing. Across the board, you find that it begins to just ripple with issues of not knowing our worth, not knowing our value, not knowing what God says about us. We use sex as a tool. We use it as a weapon against one another. We use it, for affirmation, for all these things that God already had to say about us. We don't realize. Don't realize it.
Yeah. One thing that I think, again, the enemy uses as deception is that only single people deal with, these sexual encounters. Right. A married couple, once you're married, it's over. It's all good. There's no temptation. They all just disappear, which I think is great that your book tackles that. It talks about the sexpectations. And, I just quickly, how would you say that those can be, like, even just that mindset in general can be dangerous in a marriage?
Yeah, it's so true. Sex in marriage it's so funny. I stood at the altar too. I write about this in the book. I stood at the altar and thought, finally, I'm saying I do. This is kind of the end of my sexual testimony. But it's just not the truth. Mm-hmm. Sex in marriage is where it comes into the fullness of what God intended it to be. And so therefore the enemy will attack it all the more heavily, all the more relentlessly. The enemy will suddenly try to divide us in marriage. And what happens is, if we have unresolved, unrepentant sin from singleness, we carry in that baggage into marriage, and suddenly that affects that union. If we have, I call them false expectations of, what sex is going to be like in marriage, or the purpose of it in marriage, if we haven't really, educated our hearts and been, had revelation to our hearts from God of what sex truly is and the power of it, we bring these false expectations into marriage. And, we think that it's meant as just something, just a pleasurable thing for us. We think it's, meant whenever we want it, however we want it, that our spouse is just there for that. I mean, the laundry list of things that it becomes and morphs into in marriage. It becomes this tool we actually wield against one another and withhold from one another. And it can become such a divisive thing in marriage if healing has not pulsed through our sexual understanding. And I feel like the enemy just loves it. I feel like he loves this beautiful gift that God's given us. If he can twist it and warp it, then within marriage, we can't exercise it fully. And a lot of marriages suffer and many end because of sexually rooted issues. And it's hard, because that's where I feel like the attack comes. We think singleness is hard. It's like getting to marriage and, have unresolved sexual stuff. And it's like a sword we don't know how to wield, and we hurt ourselves along the way. And so, it doesn't stop at the altar. It begins really in so many ways there. Right. And it can be something through our whole marriage that can grow, that can foster unification and beauty and power, so much power, as God always intended it to. But we got to talk about it. We got to talk about it and learn how and why.
Right. And, what are some encouraging words, or maybe a piece of advice that you would give to someone who is dealing with sexual addiction? What is it that they need to hear the most? And
I'm going to be completely honest. We've dealt with youth before. Yeah. I think the majority of our life we've run a youth group. We've been involved in young adults. And I'm telling you, this topic of sex and the sin, the sexual temptation that's out there is stronger than ever.
Yeah, it's huge.
And I think a topic like this is powerful. And like my wife said, for that struggling youth that's struggling, even in a marriage, what kind of advice would you give them?
The first thing I would say would be still and know that he is God. Yeah. Psalms 46:10. We've got to stop and come up for air. We are so in the throes and so enslaved to so many of these